There's the last couple. Awesome. All looks good. So hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Em. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library. We are thrilled to be hosting tonight's Camden Conference community event. I'm happy to turn it over to Bill Buckhovner, who serves on the Camden Conference Community Events Committee, and will be introducing tonight's speaker. Bill, go right ahead.
Thank you, Em. My name is Bill Buckhovner, and on behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. We would like to thank Camden Public Library for making these programs possible, and we would also like to thank the World Affairs Council of Maine for sharing Bill Hall with our community. The Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers from our community. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. In keeping with our mission, we offer a series of community events leading up to our annual weekend conference. These free events are intended to provide background on the yearly topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in its three-day format. The views, opinions, and positions expressed by our presenters are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the Camden Conference. This year's conference, our 35th, Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad, will take place February 25th through 27, 2022. The Board of Directors has decided to have the 2022 conference live and in person. Not at the Camden Opera House, however, but nearby at a venue with sufficient room for spaced seating, the Strom Theater at Camden Hills Regional High School, as well as streaming online as last year. COVID protocols will be followed at the venue. Information on tickets will be available soon, and Camden Conference members will be able to purchase them first. Tonight, as part of the conference community event series, it is my pleasure to introduce Bill Hall, who shares his insights into Eastern Europe 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Bill is the president of the World Affairs Council of Maine. He was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force and spent nearly 18 years overseas in Asia and Europe. Bill graduated from Princeton University with a bachelor's degree in politics and from the University of Virginia with a master's degree in foreign affairs. He lives with his wife, Nancy, on Peaks Island. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's great to be here, and it's great to see this audience. This is fantastic. And I want to thank the Rockland Library for being able to host us tonight, and especially the Camden Conference, which I absolutely love, for making this possible. As Bill said, I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Maine, and of course we work closely with the Camden Conference on events. And we think it's really important that Maine is connected to the world. And I think the Camden Conference does a fantastic job of that, as well as us folks down here in Portland who run the World Affairs Council of Maine. So great to have an audience here tonight. And since the Camden Conference theme this year will be Europe. And I remember, I think I see V is on here tonight, but V Sheehan asked me, hey, would you like to do a presentation at a community level? And of course I said yes, foolishly, and here I am. But I thought, well, Eastern Europe might be interesting. And it's not an area we hear a lot about. It's an odd sort of area. I did spend some time there during my career. So I thought it would be fun to talk about Eastern Europe. And in particular, Eastern Europe, because there's kind of a little bit of an anniversary in a way. It's pretty significant for the world. And that is in December 1991, so 30 years ago, pretty close to this day, the Soviet Union came apart. And that changed everything for the United States. It changed really, literally everything for the world. It was truly a momentous event. But it changed in particular the countries of Eastern Europe, because suddenly you had countries who were formerly republics of the old Soviet Union that now all of a sudden became independent states. And you also had countries that were part of the old Soviet bloc, independent countries, but truly not very independent, pretty tightly controlled by the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden they were turned loose as well. And so 30 years ago, over a period of time, these countries had to adapt to a whole new world. And believe me, having served in Eastern Europe, this was really a new world for them. I mean, it was a completely new way of thinking. And it wasn't just their political arrangement, it affected literally everything in their lives. So a truly momentous event. And I'd be glad to talk about it tonight. And what I thought I would do to get started is I have a deck of slides. PowerPoint. Sorry. Anyway, I think it's a great system. And so I've got some slides I want to show you. And while I'm talking, I will have the slides up. But if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do that. I love questions during the course of the presentation. They add a little life to it. So I would welcome questions, certainly. Also, questions can probably go in the chat. That's fine. And there'll be some time probably at the end for questions as well. So I think if Em will allow me, I hope I've got the permission to share. Oh, there it is right there. I'm going to push share screen here. And what I'm going to do is run through a little slideshow with you and talk as we go. So again, feel free to ask questions if you'd like to. I'm just going to switch over to slide. So here we are, Eastern Europe. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Don't you love that picture? I just think that's fantastic. That's Slovenia. Slovenia is a tiny little place, an independent country, off in the corner with Austria and Italy. And it's just really pretty. This is a part of the Slovenian Alps. But this is about 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I'm going to get started, and hopefully these slides are going to change as I go. Oops, I'm going to have to go click a different button. Here we go. So the interesting thing about Eastern Europe to begin with is, where is it? What is it? And there is no, believe me, there is no standard definition to Eastern Europe. So what is it? It depends on who you talk to or who you read from. And everybody defines it differently. But this is a map that I pulled together here. And I would think one of the great challenges for all of us would be to actually name all those colored countries in there. Could you name them? Believe me, before I started working on this, I actually couldn't name them all. So I'm going to talk about 20 countries that are in that map right there. And again, definitions of what is Eastern Europe can change. Well, a set of countries I'm going to talk about is the Baltics, for example. I lumped them into the Eastern Europe, but they're also considered the Baltics. So you'll find them mentioned in that region as well. I am not, interestingly enough, going to talk about Greece. And Greece is unique. It's the southern end of the Balkan Peninsula, but frequently not really talked about in the context of Eastern Europe, which I think is kind of interesting, or talked about in the context of the Balkans. It's talked about most often in the context of the Mediterranean or maybe Southern Europe. So I will not be discussing anything about Greece tonight, but I will be talking about 20 other countries that make up Eastern Europe. The phrase too, Eastern Europe, is sort of odd, I have to admit, because if you're looking at this map and you think, well, Eastern Europe, wouldn't that be Russia? That's a very good point. And to a great extent, it certainly would be. Russia's a little complicated because it's so big, it goes all the way over to Asia and the Pacific. But yeah, you could certainly think of Western Russia as part of Eastern Europe. But in this case, what I'm thinking of is Eastern Europe, really right up to the borderline with Russia. And frequently also, just to clarify another point, you may hear the term Central Europe. And Central Europe, typically a lot of people will talk about it as maybe including Germany and Poland, Czechia, countries like that. But again, we won't deal with that particular term. We're just going to stick to Eastern Europe as the point of coverage for this presentation. So there they are. There are all the countries, and we'll get to know them a little better, hopefully. And I'll talk about pretty much each one in turn. Eastern Europe is really interesting. I just found it absolutely fascinating. And one of the reasons it's so interesting is it's a land between empires. So you've got these small, mostly small, pretty, not all, but mostly small countries living in the middle of gigantic empires. And, you know, you see one that says the German Empire. I don't think we describe that as the German Empire today, but truly it was an empire, the most powerful state in Europe at one time. And now today, again, interestingly enough, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had an enormous impact on Eastern Europe and the way we define Eastern Europe today, because so much of the lands of Eastern Europe were once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But then you have the Russian Empire. And again, quite a few of the countries that we're talking about today as members or parts of Eastern Europe were actually part of the Russian Empire at one time. So here you've got all these places with all these different people living, and they're literally crushed between empires. And see this little note down there below the black box? Eastern Europe is filled by little people living in desperate fear of annihilation. Well, I think that is an interesting way to define Eastern Europe. And this is a comment, by the way, from a really good author named John Connolly, who wrote an excellent history of Eastern Europe called From Peoples into Nations. Very interesting history of Eastern Europe. But this is basically his comment. And by little peoples, he doesn't mean physically little people, but he means countries that typically are fairly small and don't have large populations, and certainly not compared to the large empires that either owned them or were adjacent to them. So here we are, Eastern Europe, a land between empires, filled by little peoples living in desperate fear of annihilation. Why would they live in desperate fear of annihilation? Because they're crushed between empires. And there's also a little problem of relations among themselves as well. And these people are worried that, and to a great extent, part of the history of Eastern Europe is how to keep, if I would put it this way, my people alive. How to ensure, if I'm a Montenegrin, that Montenegro continues to exist and the Montenegrin people continue to exist. It's actually a driver, especially since the 19th century and on into the 20th and now into the 21st. It's still a driver today of some motivations of some of the things you see going on in Eastern Europe. A desperate fear of annihilation means somebody is out there who might be more powerful than you, and you might lose your culture, language, or even your existence. But going back to the 30 years ago, I think you probably, if you were alive during this time, I certainly found this a fascinating time, 1989 to 1991. A short span of time, but a truly earth-shaking revolution. And it was a fascinating thing to watch. And at the time, I was stationed in Germany. So here, and I had a previous assignment in Berlin, as a matter of fact. At this time, I was over in Western Germany. But I watched this from afar on television, literally on German news, literally every day, every night, this revolution occurring. And it started with the gradual, and I think the 1980s were really the critical period here, the gradual weakening of Russia and the Soviet Union over this period of time. You know, the Chernobyl disaster was clearly an indication that the economic system, the political system, everything about the old Soviet Union and the communist states was not keeping up with the West and was in a state of devolution. And what happened was, it's very interesting the role that Hungary played in all this. Hungary literally opened the gate. It literally opened the gate that started this revolution from 1989 to 91. And when I say that, I mean, when East Germans who had travel rights, East Germany had travel rights to Hungary because Hungary was a member of the Warsaw Pact. Hungary was part of the Soviet bloc. You could travel from East Germany to Hungary. Well, literally what happened was thousands of East Germans fed up with East Germany and the life they were living there took off for Hungary. And they filled up the capital of Hungary, which was just absolutely amazing. And then Hungary, to everyone's surprise, literally opened the door. Then they opened the door to Austria. And all of a sudden, you had a flood of East Germans going into Austria through Hungary. It was an amazing, absolutely amazing event. And the next thing that happened, and again, I'm leaving out a lot of detail here, but these are sort of the big things, the Berlin Wall came down. And it was almost accidental how that happened. An East German guard, actually a captain of the guards, allowed people to travel through the wall over from East Berlin to West Berlin. And the next thing you know, people were attacking that wall, literally physically tearing it down. And all during these events, 1989 to 1991, Gorbachev, head of the Soviet Union, did not intervene, which was an absolutely crucial decision. He could have brought Soviet troops in, right, to try to prevent this. I'm not sure they would have been successful, but they did not intervene, and that is a very crucial point. And the revolution itself in 1991 moved into the Soviet Union. And Yeltsin, who was by that time president of Russia, actually took the steps in 1991, in fact, in December 1991, that ended up dissolving the Soviet Union. It's very interesting, too, how that happened, because it was something I don't think Gorbachev expected. I don't think Yeltsin expected. I don't think anyone expected it. But Yeltsin literally was in a meeting in Belarus, and he was meeting with the head of Belarus, the head of the Communist Party of Belarus. He was also meeting with Leonid Kravchuk from Ukraine. And Ukraine was really putting pressure on Yeltsin to become independent. Ukraine was a republic in the Soviet Union, but really interested in independence, and wanted a new arrangement with Russia that would give Ukraine sovereignty. And in effect, Yeltsin, the representative from Belarus, I've forgotten his name, and Kravchuk sat down and wrote a new, really almost like a constitution for the arrangements for these republics of the Soviet Union, which was stunning. They did it with really a couple of nights, basically, with a lot of vodka. And literally Yeltsin brought that agreement back to Moscow and presented it to Gorbachev. And within a very short time after that, Gorbachev literally was out of the political hierarchy in Russia. But Yeltsin and two others literally wrote the paper that ended up dissolving the Soviet Union. I mean, this was an incredible, shocking, surprising event, and happened all in 1991. In December 91, 30 years ago, this thing happened. And we lost the USSR. The Soviet republics over time became independent states. They were incorporated into something that was the Commonwealth of independent states, which had its kind of leadership from Moscow, but that did not last very long. Eastern European nations, and in particular, if you think about Belarus and Ukraine in this case, provided both the actors who generated this process and also provided the stage. So here we go. We're in a really totally new world when this happened. Well, it was such a shock. I always, you kind of ask, well, what did we expect? Here we are with the Soviet Union changing, morphing into something new, which, if you look at the states who were involved with it, that now is a Commonwealth of Independent States. What did we expect to happen if this actually took place? I mean, it was such a shock. Honestly, we had no planning for it at the time. But as a result, when you look at this thing and you think, well, this is what's happened, what did we think was going on? Well, first, we were pretty certain that there was an embrace of democratic capitalism going on. In other words, a recognition that the Soviet system, the communist system, had utterly failed. And that recognition was widespread, and that the replacement for that was going to be democratic capitalism. What's democratic capitalism? It's capitalism. It's a market economy. That's what capitalism truly is, a market economy. What's democratic? It means people have the right to vote. They have the right to select their leadership. They have a right to select their structure of government. That's what democratic means. And it means everybody has that right. Everybody who lives in the space that may be a nation has the right to shape their own government. It also meant, again, we recognize this is fundamental political and economic change. It's going to change the political structures across the board. If democratic capitalism ends up, as the sort of choice for the world at this point, then obviously you're going to have enormous economic change. It also meant open borders, movement. This was so interesting to me, being over in Germany at the time and also traveling over into Eastern Europe, all during this period. Movement was everywhere. And interesting, stationed in Berlin in the mid-'80s, and I used to travel over to East Germany and East Berlin, you didn't see this movement. You saw things that were just, to me, looked like they were barely moving at all. And all of a sudden, these borders, these barriers come down, and there is movement everywhere. And the most striking thing I noticed was the German, if you lived in Germany, the German highways filled up. They filled up from cars from all over Eastern Europe. They filled up with trucks in ways that I had just never, ever seen before. And I'd been stationed in Germany. I had actually 3 different assignments in Germany. I never saw anything like this. Suddenly there was movement everywhere, and it was absolutely stunning. The other question was, what about German reunification? This was a very significant issue because East Germany was incorporated into the Soviet bloc. I don't think ever expected to ever reunite with Germany. But all of a sudden you got Helmut Kohl saying, basically, East Germany is going to become part of Germany. And Helmut Kohl carried the day, clearly, even though there was some reluctance on the part of the British and the French. George Bush decided he would support Helmut Kohl on this point, and German reunification occurred rather quickly. In fact, it was only about a 2-year process for this to actually happen. So Helmut Kohl led the way, and Germany was reunited. East Germany once again became part of the large nation of Germany. There was also the question about, well, what do you do with these multinational institutions that exist in Europe? In particular, the European Union and NATO. Are these going to expand? And that was a question that had to be answered. So you had to literally redesign these multinational institutions, which had gotten pretty comfortable with the membership they already had, to think about letting in some of the little peoples who were afraid of annihilation, but they wanted to be they wanted to join. They absolutely wanted to join. And then NATO, what do you do with NATO? You don't, they right away decided we're not going to station NATO troops in the eastern part of Germany. I think that was a very good decision. But would NATO expand? And that was a very, very serious question. That was a really serious question. And, and I read a lot today about NATO expansion. And one of the points being, maybe it was not a good idea because it looked threatening to the Soviet Union. At the time, and again, I got involved with the NATO expansion and how we actually implemented that on the ground. It did not seem a threat to the Soviet Union, to Russia now today, even because Russia, interestingly enough, was actually playing a part of that. And there was a time in the 90s, we honestly thought Russia may actually become part of NATO. And the mission of NATO would be changed to integrate armed forces to carry out peacekeeping, peace building activities in Europe, maybe in other parts of the world. In fact, that's what it did. So is NATO going to expand? An open question. And fairly soon, the conclusion was reached, yes, it will expand. And in all of this, can you think back 30 years now? I mean, isn't this different? Can you think about the opportunities for American leadership? They were absolutely enormous. They were absolutely in every sphere, in the economic sphere, in infrastructure, in the military sphere, the political sphere, everywhere. The opportunities for American leadership were enormous. And people actually sought American leadership. I remember I worked a lot with foreign nations during my military career, but I remember this period of time very well when people who were part of NATO would literally come to me and say, well, you know, we're waiting to hear what the United States wants to do. We're not going to move without knowing what the United States is going to do. And so American leadership was huge. Also, I was stationed in Bulgaria for 2 years in the late 1990s. And Bulgaria had gone through several changes of government over about less than a 10-year period. But finally, they had settled on a center-right type of government that really was dying to get into the European Union because they saw that as a way out of where they were and also to join NATO. So the pressure from these folks in Eastern Europe to join both the European Union and NATO was absolutely enormous. The opportunities for American leadership were huge. And again, I have so many examples of this, but I remember one time being the defense attaché in Bulgaria. One day, the other defense attachés had an intervention with me. They honestly said, we think you're being too nice with the Bulgarians. You need to do this. If you do this, we will follow. It was very interesting. So there was something I learned from my allied friends. And sure enough, literally, they did expect the United States to take the leadership over and over again. And that became really obvious in the case of Serbia. So here, those were our expectations. What's going to happen to Russia? What's going to happen to Germany? What's going to happen to the European Union? What's going to happen to NATO? American leadership, democratic capitalism, borders opening up, things, people, goods, everything moving all through the area. Those things, that's what we expected. What actually happened? A lot of those things actually happened. There were tremendous positive political and economic changes that occurred throughout Eastern Europe. It was just phenomenal. Countries, it may have taken some time. There was certainly a huge amount of adaptation that had to happen, but countries began to grow in ways they had never dreamed of before. And in Poland is a great example of that. I mean, you had to get rid of whole industries in some cases, but once you had made this tough transition, the opportunities for economic growth really opened up. They were not opening it. The 1980s was a period of terrible decline in the communist states. So the 1990s were a period of renewal that was absolutely stunning. I'll tell you, and being over in Eastern Europe at the time, there was excitement, there were new beginnings, and I would describe this as a consultant's paradise. There were consultants showing up from everywhere, and especially from the United States, because Americans always had the answer. And the consultants might be coming over to read. I remember the people were coming from Portland, by the way. I met lawyers from Portland, and I hadn't moved to Portland yet, who were coming over to redesign the Bulgarian power system. Isn't that amazing? I met David Flanagan. David Flanagan came over because he was a trustee for the American University in Bulgaria. So David Flanagan and I used to travel to the American University and talk to the students, the professors there. And I remember once going down there and trying to explain, this is a little later, so we're talking now about toward the late 90s, trying to explain why the United States wanted to bomb Serbia. You imagine explaining that to a bunch of students? I mean, that was certainly an interesting experience for me. There were some obviously very tough questions, but it was a very exciting time. There's no doubt about it. The European Union and the NATO began expansion processes, and they took on new member states. And they had to write, and each country got a plan. So now here's what you have to do to become a member of, say, the European Union, or to become a member of NATO. You had to have a plan, and I helped write the plan for Bulgaria, which was really interesting. Here are the things they had to do, and it was fascinating. It was a total reform of the military, the size of the military, the rank structure of the military, the systems the military operated, the tactics the military used, how they treated recruits, which was pretty brutal before they changed that system. I mean, it was a complete redo of the military system. And that was their action plan they had to follow in order to become a member of NATO. And again, good things. I think the reunification of Germany was terrific. Ukraine denuclearized. I think we sometimes forget that. But there were all kinds of missiles and nuclear weapons stationed as part of the Soviet Union stationed in Ukraine. And Ukraine allowed that to all be taken apart, which is stunning. We would fly, and being in intelligence, we were very much involved with trying to make sure we identified where all the nuclear weapons were. And the Ukrainians were incredibly cooperative in all this, and so were the Russians, interestingly enough. But I remember we would fly in cargo planes and literally load up nuclear materials from Ukraine and take them back to the United States. Ukraine completely denuclearized. So all the weapons, the nuclear weapons that were stationed there went away. Czechoslovakia split. That doesn't sound very good, does it? But it was peaceful. It was a velvet divorce, as it was described. So Slovakia went off as an independent country. Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic, or if you say it really in Czech, or in a Slavic language, it's Czechia. So Czechia is the country today. The picture I took, this is a picture I took right here, then you'll see that the words there, Regional Airspace Initiative. This was one of those good things that happened. And I was involved with this, and what was going on was we were literally designing the way airspace was controlled in Southern Europe, because previously that airspace had all belonged to the military. So the military in each nation controlled the airspace. If you were a civilian, you had to request, and that included commercial airlines, you had to request permission from the military to fly through the airspace. This was completely changed around. So we got with all the nations in Southern Europe, we had these conferences, we had lots of experts there, and it was called the Regional Airspace Initiative. This is the Bulgarian party here, which I was kind of part of, as well as representing the United States. And we went off to Macedonia and worked out a completely redesign of the airspace. And who controls the airspace? Civil authority controlled the airspace by the time we were done. And it became much easier, by the way, to fly from one country to another, or fly across or over these countries. And that was all part of the things that were among the good things that happened when this great revolution took place. Unfortunately, there were some bad things that happened, and they may or may not have been connected to anything going on in Eastern Europe. Clearly, the breaking apart of Yugoslavia was a bad thing. I mean, it was a good thing if you think you want to be independent of Yugoslavia, right? But the process of doing that was bloody. The most violent wars occurred that had been occurring in Europe since World War II. There were bloody fights between Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia. There were fights in Bosnia. It was incredible. And the only way that was ever stopped was putting enough pressure on Serbia, which involved arming. We actually armed, we did it secretly, but we actually armed the Croatian forces, for example. And we also carried out airstrikes against Serbian facilities, enough pressure on Serbia so that it would allow Bosnia, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, and that was probably about it at the time, to split off from Serbia and become independent states. That was a tough process. I would add just one more thing into that. It wasn't over until Kosovo became an independent state as well, and that was in 1999. And again, we had to go through the same fight because the Serbians had sent huge task force tanks, in fact, lots of tanks into Kosovo to suppress the independence movement that was taking place there. That was stopped by a 39-day air campaign led by NATO. And one of the things I had to do as a defense attaché in Bulgaria was convince the Bulgarians, who were pretty friendly with the Serbians, to allow NATO to use Bulgarian airspace to fly over Bulgaria and bomb Serbia, and also fly control aircraft like the E-3A, which is called the AWACS, over Bulgarian airspace. And that was an interesting issue to try to get Bulgaria to agree to that. And I remember one day getting a phone call from the chief of the Air Force. He said, "Bill, come over to my office, but don't bring a translator." And I went over to his office and he said, "We're going to let you use our airspace to attack Serbia, but you can come only during this time." And it was at nighttime. You can fly over Bulgaria at nighttime. And since we will know you're coming, we're going to turn off all of our radar. We're going to turn off our air defense systems. And the reason they did that was their air defense systems, their missile systems, their radar systems were identical to Serbia's. And obviously they didn't want a NATO aircraft to shoot at them thinking that they were going to launch a missile. So the chief of the Air Force gave me the hours of night that were available to NATO for NATO to fly over his airspace, and which was phenomenal. I asked if I could pass that to Brussels, and he said, "Yes, tell Brussels." But this was all part of the effort to get Kosovo, the mostly Albanian population living in Kosovo, independence. Obviously, 9/11 occurred during this 30-year period, and the US launched its war on terror, which to me is, it's not over by any means, but it has culminated in the dreadful scenes in Afghanistan that we've all witnessed just recently. The financial world crashed in 2008, and this had an enormous impact on Europe. So this was not a good thing. It set back a lot of the economic gains that had been made, and also had a major impact on undermining the strength of democratic capitalism as an attractive model to organize your economy. I think that's something we tend to forget. So the financial crash in 2008 is, it set us on a bad path in a lot of directions, and helped, I think, lead to the rise of some of the less democratic movements that we have going on in Europe today. Russia also seized Crimea from Ukraine and then occupied the Donbass region, which is of eastern Ukraine. And this was because Russia, by this time, so now we're talking about seizing Ukraine, this piece of territory of Ukraine in 2014. By this time, Russia had recovered a great deal of the strength that it lost in the 1990s. And Russia was being led by Vladimir Putin, of course. Yeltsin had resigned, and Putin put Russia on a path to growth using the enormous oil revenues that were coming into Russia, and still do, and pumping a lot of that money into the military. And Putin had the intent to return Russia to the sphere of great powers. And I think that's what he did. Not a very good character for us to deal with, certainly, but he's certainly raised the posture of Russia from what it was in the 1990s. It was truly a decrepit state in the 1990s, there's no doubt about it. So now it's exercising its military strength and its political strength in ways that certainly affect everything happening in the near region to Russia. The other thing that happened, obviously, is the pandemic. And the pandemic is still going on today, as you know, and it's put a lot of stress on all of the countries of Eastern Europe, not to mention the rest of the world. And how do you deal with that if you don't have an effective political system? I mean, in some countries, the dealing with the pandemic has not gone well at all. Hungary, if I just take Hungary as an example, it has the second highest death rate from the coronavirus of any country on earth. So the pandemic has been an extreme challenge to the countries of Eastern Europe. The other thing I would mention is the international system changed during this 30 years. And this is be pretty obvious to everybody here, I'm pretty sure. But China clearly rose in a huge fashion. And Russia, as I've already mentioned, reemerged. So Russia reemerged as a great power. And over this time, in the 30 years, you think about what it felt like 30 years ago with the United States, and the world depended on leadership of the United States so incredibly, just the amount of dependence was just incredible. But the US has declined. So if you look at our capacity to affect events in the world, the capacity we have for action, I think that's declined. So that's one of the international system changes that have affected the world, but also Eastern Europe. Populist political movements, strongman governments arose. And this is not confined just to Eastern Europe, by the way. As you know, it's confined to Russia, right? It's part of the story of Central Asia. It's part of the story of Western Europe, even to some extent. It's part of the story of Latin America. And you could see these political movements arise. And really, if you're talking about the growth of autocracy in certain countries, the playbook is familiar. You see the same playbook being exercised over and over again. And this was part of the systemic change that was going on throughout the world. The capitalist economic model failed to deliver as expected. And I think it delivered. I mean, it's still, if you look at just Eastern Europe, their economic conditions have mostly improved quite a bit from the 1980s. There's no doubt about it. But it still didn't deliver what people expected. And when I was living in Bulgaria again in the late 90s, I would hear so often from the Bulgarians how this capitalism was such a failure. At least I had a job. At least I could go to a hospital. My life was taken care of. They weren't so, they had no political freedom. They couldn't choose to elect their government, for example. But quite a few of them were happy with that if they had what they considered to be some degree of economic security. All of a sudden, all of that is replaced by this capitalist model, which largely in an awful lot of places became a criminal model, not a capitalist model. So there was a great deal of disappointment. And I think this was true throughout a lot of Eastern Europe with capitalism. And what capitalism was expected to bring you didn't show up. Multilateral institutions lost their luster. They stagnated. And I think that's really true today. The last admission to the European Union was in 2013, and that was Croatia. There has not been a new admission to the European Union since then. Do countries want as badly to join the Union as they did in the 1990s? I don't think so. And I think the European Union has somewhat stagnated at this point. And if you read some writings from the European Union, they felt that they had expanded too rapidly, and they had brought in countries into the European Union. Some members of the Union will say this, too rapidly. They brought in, for example, Bulgaria and Romania. And I even heard a talk by a Western European about what a mistake that was. These countries weren't ready for European Union membership. So clearly they have, I think the enthusiasm for the expansion of the European Union has been lost. I would say the same to some degree, but not nearly as much in NATO. There's, NATO expansion most countries are already members of NATO, so it's really amazing. There aren't a lot left to join the alliance, but I think some of the enthusiasm for the expansion of NATO has declined. Russia just recently pulled its delegation out of Brussels entirely, that calling NATO a threat to the Russian state. And Germany, of course, emerged as the anchor of Europe. And Germany grew in strength as it reconsolidated with Eastern Germany. And also, if you think about in terms of population and economic impact, Germany has had a very successful economy. Surprisingly, a lot of it depends on the growth of China. But with Brexit and the departure of Great Britain from the European Union, you've got Germany truly acting as the anchor of Europe. And I think that's an interesting position for Germany to be in. One of the reasons it's been really a good anchor is the fact that Angela Merkel has been in charge for so long. Well, now we've got an election in Germany. We've got a new party showing up. The Social Democrats will try to form a government, and it'll be interesting to see what they can do from this point on. But Germany truly has emerged as the strongman of Europe. So international system changes. So now where are we? So there was an article called The End of History, which was following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dominance of the United States in the globe. And I would say now, 30 years later, we are not at the end of history. We're in a better place in many ways. Despite, I know I concentrate a lot on the problems because they're the things you sort of focus on anyway. But in a lot of ways, conditions have improved for people living in Eastern Europe. Not completely, but certainly better than it was under the communist regimes. And what I want to do is really run through quickly at the national level these countries in Eastern Europe and talk about, how are they getting along today? And I'll just run through it in a geographic manner and really quickly. So it won't take a long time to do this. So don't be too frightened by the fact that I'm going to go through this. But I'm going to start up north with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Belarus. And just real quickly, their situations today. I won't get into detail. This is kind of high level. But if you look at the three Baltic republics, they have enjoyed an enormous economic benefit from being independent countries now and trading with the West and having different types of governments in charge, democratic governments with capitalist economic models. But the issue for them is security. And the issue, why is security? Because they're right on the border with the Soviet Union, or with Russia, right? Sorry, keep calling it Soviet Union, with Russia. And Russia has made it known that their continued existence depends on good relations with Russia. And it's pretty obvious that's the case. So they've always got security concerns. They're all members of NATO now, but they never will lose the security concerns because of their location in Eastern Europe. Belarus, on the other hand, has a different relationship with Russia. Belarus is literally the white Russians that were part of Russia to begin with. Belarus is about as close to Russia as you could get. Belarus is having, as you could, and the picture on the right there is Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya. Now Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya is the leader of the opposition in Belarus. Belarus had an election last year, which Lukashenko, being in charge now for a very long time, won, believe it or not, 85% of the vote, which was pretty amazing, while the country is going downhill in so many respects, going downhill economically, going downhill with the pandemic. And it had this election that Lukashenko completely invalidated through crime, basically, and stole. And all of a sudden you had, as you know from last year, lots of huge demonstrations in Belarus. And Belarus depends and Lukashenko right now depends on its continued existence. I mentioned relations with Russia there as far as the three Baltic republics. It's different with Belarus. Belarus needs tight relations with Russia and a guarantee of continued existence in order to stay as an independent state. So what Lukashenko has done is, even though he started out as very independent of Russia at the beginning and really advertised Belarusian nationalism, he has now shifted completely to be a kind of a subservient to Moscow, to Putin. And he depends on Putin for his continued hold on politics and the continued existence of the Belarusian state. He's a very unpopular leader. The economic situation in Belarus is terrible. And yet this is what he depends on to keep going. So that's Belarus's situation. The three Baltic republics are all members of NATO. They were from early times. They got in pretty quickly. And the other issue, I would say, the big issue and this really is Belarus governance. So what you've got is a dictatorship, autocratic government, very criminal, lots of corruption, with just the worst governance you can imagine, hanging on because of its support by Putin. And by the way, Belarus has been moving more and more into an economic union with Russia, and that's part of the effort to try to stay alive as an independent state. So we'll watch this transition of Belarus if it continues to tighter and tighter relations with Russia. What happens to the opposition? Who knows? Are they ever going to be successful? Right now, it's not looking very good because the Belarusian, Lukashenko controls the military. So he has the guns. And when you have the guns, it's easy to, well, not easy, but you can keep control of your republic. If I go down a little to the south, but run along from Poland to Ukraine. So basically you're going from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The issues for these two countries are security. Poland became a very good, very strong member of NATO, by the way, fairly early. Poland has a long nationalist tradition, perhaps longer than anyone else in Eastern Europe. A large population, so it's about 38 million people. A large economy, by far the largest economy in Eastern Europe. So a very large economy, and pretty much thinks of itself as an independent country, and been thinking of that for a long, long time, although split between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. So now Poland is a consolidated state, became a member of NATO very early. Lots of Polish immigrants, as you know, lots of people of Polish descent living in the United States. So Poland is in pretty good shape right now economically, and I'll talk about governance when I get down, because that's where the concerns are. But Ukraine has really got some serious concerns, as you know, from the seizure of Crimea, and the occupation of Eastern Ukraine, which continues to this day. And Russia is constantly putting on the pressure on Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO and Ukraine does not join the European Union. And that pressure continues. So for Ukraine, NATO membership seems extremely unlikely, and EU membership is not, as I mentioned already, the European Union is not terribly interested in expansion at this point anyway. And given the fact that Russia is exercising so much military threat against Ukraine, it doesn't seem likely that it's going to become a member of the European Union anytime soon. And governance issues, the issue with Poland right now is the Law and Justice Party they've been in charge of the politics since the 2015, and they are representing themselves as a very conservative political party, and they have done their best to establish a kind of an autocratic rule. In fact, I heard Poland described as a consolidated autocracy. Isn't that interesting? Because when you think about Poland, if you go back to 1980 and the workers' strike, it's particularly at the Gdansk shipyard, how much of an impact that had on the communist states, the psychological impact was huge. But now you've got a Poland that is running a fairly autocratic government. It has some pretty high levels of corruption and is engaged with the European Union in a way that you could almost say threatens its membership, because Poland does not want to conform to some of the rules that say you have rules that say you must have a democratic government, and wants to make sure that those rules are not applied in Poland. And Poland is looking for some economic assistance for the pandemic, and really some economic assistance to help even move recovery along from the 2008 financial crash. And the economic assistance is coming from the European Union in Brussels, with stipulation that you must have a democratic form of government. And Poland, the current Law and Justice Party, has done quite a bit to undermine the independence of the judiciary in Poland, the independence of the media in Poland, and the way elections are conducted in the country. And I would say right now, the Law and Justice Party is following the autocratic playbook. And that's the issue of governance that I think about when I think of Poland. Governance in Ukraine, Zelensky is the president in charge now, had a run-in with Trump, as you know, Trump trying to find some bad stuff on the Bidens, and was kind of caught in the middle of that between Trump and Russia. Trump coming from the West and Russia from the East. Poor guy, it was a difficult challenge for him. And Ukraine has governance issues that largely deal with corruption. And they're still there today, even though I think Zelensky has his heart in the right place. The picture on the left is our Russian troops in Crimea. The center, oops, go back one. The center is interesting because of the Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary. In Slovakia, again, somewhat autocratic government. Czechia as well, but not nearly so much. Czechia has the highest per capita income of the Eastern European states. So it looks an awful lot of respects. I remember when I traveled there, how much it looked like Germany. Hungary is very interesting. Now, Czechia and Slovakia, both members of NATO. Hungary's a member of NATO, came in fairly early, and they're all members of the European Union. The issue in particular with Hungary is it's following the same autocratic playbook as Poland, but even more so. Viktor Orban is the president of Hungary, and he is setting himself up now. First, his main way of winning elections back in the 2015s was to set himself up against the immigrants trying to come into Europe, and that made him very popular in the country. Now he's trying to advertise the defense of Christianity, and that's Tucker Carlson, by the way, from Fox News, who was doing some programs over in Hungary, invited by Orban to come over for broadcasts from Hungary. But Orban is setting Hungary up as the defender of Christianity in Europe, and former Vice President Pence was even there on a worldwide Christian conference, which was held in Hungary. So very interesting. Orban kicked out the Central European University from Budapest, and the university, which had been set up by George Soros, had to move over to Vienna. But again, a very interesting fellow because of the autocratics. Again, following the same playbook about the judiciary, electoral process, media, things like that leave you in charge without any worries about elections kicking you out. So that's Viktor Orban over there, and quite a reputation right now. The European Union response to that, by the way, has been pretty gentle. So even though they're not convinced that Hungary has a truly democratic government at this point, they have not really taken measures to counter that in any way. There aren't any kind of sanctions that they're applying to Hungary at this point. The South is the interesting area because of the remainders of ethno-nationalist conflict, which is still going in the South, and it is driven to quite an extent by Serbia, and the fact that the Serbs, now why would Serbia be involved in so many of these? Serbian populations were spread out throughout the Southern Balkans. So Serbian people lived in Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, not very many, few in Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, large Serbian population, to some degree in Hungary, a relatively large population in Croatia, and Serbia was really the heartland of the former Yugoslavia. And when that broke apart, of course, there was a great deal of violence where Serbia tried to keep them in Yugoslavia and tried to really reconstitute the nation that was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia has long since disappeared, but there are lingering conflicts throughout Southern Balkans largely because of Serbia. The most notable one right now is between Serbia and Kosovo. And there are others. If I look at Bosnia and Herzegovina has a large Muslim population from the days of the Turkish rule of the Ottoman rule, and has a Catholic population of Croatians, and then a Slav population of Serbians, all living in that same state called Bosnia and Herzegovina. And really, the communities act almost like independent governments. So Bosnia and Herzegovina does not have what I would consider to be a single national government. NATO membership has a lot of these states in the Balkans. Bulgaria is a member. Montenegro is a member. Not a lot of other ones. Let's see, Slovenia and Croatia members, but a lot of the other ones, Romania is a member of NATO, but some of the other ones are not included in NATO membership. And mostly several are not included in the EU membership either. Croatia, the last country, entered into European Union membership in 2013. Since then, none of these countries like Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania, etc., none of those has become a member of the European Union. There is a considerable amount of governance and corruption problems when you talk about the Southern Balkans. Unfortunately, my old home, if I could call it that, of Bulgaria, really has some serious problems. And the biggest problem really with Bulgaria, they've been through a lot of different governments, very great deal of instability, but also the biggest problem has been the amount of corruption, which is really a big problem. When I think about Eastern Europe, just some facts for you. If I just think about all these little countries, the smallest, by the way, is Kosovo, which is in the Southern Balkans. It's about a little bit smaller than Connecticut. The largest, when we go back up north again, is Ukraine, which is a little bit smaller than Texas. And the average size of the East European countries, the 20 countries I mentioned, the average size is about the size of Virginia. Population, 176 million people. It's about 53% of the US. The largest being Poland, with Ukraine with 44 million, then Poland and Romania. And the gross domestic product, even though there's been a lot of economic growth in Eastern Europe, the gross domestic product right now is $2.2 trillion annually, which is about 1/10 of the US level. The largest economy being Poland, then Romania, Hungary, and Czechia. So 30 years later, what does all this mean? The little people, I love John Connolly's comment. The little people are still here. And mostly, I apologize because I do concentrate largely on the problems, but mostly they're better off than they were 30 years ago. Almost all of them are better off economically. There are still clusters that aren't better off, but generally speaking, they are. And when I lived in Bulgaria, I heard a lot of complaints about capitalism and how they used to have a secure life and they no longer do. But I would say the transition continues. We're not done. 30 years later, the transition in how do you create a successful economy? How do you have democratic capitalism? How do you ensure that people can vote, that you're not suppressing the media, that you have independent civic life? So not everything is controlled by the government or the principal party. So those are things that continue today. How do you control corruption? That is a huge problem for a lot of these countries. So I would say all of them are in transition, and maybe transition is something that never goes away. The United States is in transition. But again, I would say also, while global changes make this transition more challenging. So if you look at the international system and you look at China and what is China doing in Eastern Europe, not a great deal, but it is applying a considerable amount of money to Greece, bought the Piraeus port, for example, which is really huge right there outside of Athens, and is also funneling money into Serbia. So the Chinese are playing a role there. The Russians obviously are playing a major role in Eastern Europe, in particular with the pressure that they're putting actively every day, literally on Ukraine, and the kind of psychological pressure they exercise on the Baltic states. So, and again, you've got some ongoing, and I mentioned in particular the Serbia and Kosovo, and potential conflicts which are adding risk to this transition. So there we are, 30 years later, 20 different countries, all fascinating places, and they're all still in transition today. And I think it's a really interesting region. I hope some of you get some, if you haven't already, get some chance to travel there. So that is my presentation tonight. And this is a picture I took of the Rila Monastery in Bulgaria, a beautiful place in the Bulgarian mountains. And one of the things I would say about Southern Europe in particular, it's very mountainous. And the mountains, when you think about how do you get so many peoples in these small places, the mountains are a big factor in that. When you have tribes moving into these places to settle, in particular, large numbers of Slavic tribes, they all form their own groups, which later become nations, and their languages all evolve. Their languages all change. A person, from one village to another, maybe they speak a slightly different dialect, they can understand each other. But by the time you're a Slavic person who learns Bulgarian, for example, and you're all the way up in Poland, those languages, they're Slavic, but they're quite different. You may not understand each other. So a great, interesting region of the world with many small countries and many different languages or language dialects and lots of different ways of living. A very interesting place. So that concludes my talk tonight. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Well, Bill, I have some questions in the chat.
Sure. Yeah.
Let me give you the first one from our Kimberly Scott. She says, China has inserted itself and its vast resources to assist, in quotes, the infrastructure in several Eastern European countries. Montenegro is a key example of the so-called debt trap. And I ask your thoughts on the possible outcome.
Right. So I think that's true. I don't think China has a great deal of strategic interest in Eastern Europe, but they do invest. And one of the debt traps that you mentioned is the fact that they typically don't just throw money in, they extend a loan, which I think is interesting. So you get a loan to do something, and a lot of these projects are like Piraeus Port in Greece, are related to infrastructure, and you get a loan from China to create something, and hopefully you'll earn enough money to pay it back. Well, a lot of these countries now are having difficulty paying those loans back. The terms are not ungenerous, but the fact is the project may be slower than they expected, or may not generate as much revenue as they expected, or the government may simply not be making enough money in order to pay back these debts. So that is absolutely true. They do create, in a lot of places, since it's not gift money, it's actually lent money, you end up in a debt trap. My daughter-in-law is from Kyrgyzstan, and the Chinese went into Kyrgyzstan and offered them all kinds of money to build this gigantic coal plant for electrification. And now the Kyrgyz are having trouble paying China back. Not to mention, a certain amount of that money got funneled into pockets that didn't have anything to do with the coal plant, with the electric plant, right? That happens. So all of a sudden, you've got to pay the money back because those are the terms of the deal. And that is the way China is operating largely throughout the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you. Let me ask, Paul and Marty Rogers ask, I believe the area between Poland and Lithuania is a part of Russia, but is not connected to Russia via land. How is that area governed?
Isn't that strange? It's actually part of Russia. So it's governed as a district of Russia. It's Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, of part of Prussia. And that area has remained literally as part of Russia. So it's cut off from Russia in the sense that it's literally trapped between Poland and Lithuania, but it's governed as part of Russia, and it is Russian territory. And what the Russians have done is stationed a lot of armed forces in that area. And those armed forces act as pressure on Poland and Lithuania both.
Fred and V. Sheehan ask, are Eastern European countries having a lot of out migration?
Boy, that's a great question. The answer is yes. And a very big favorite was Britain. And I remember I have some neighbors on Peaks Island who voted for Brexit. And I said, well, why did you vote for Brexit? Too many Poles. There are too many Poles. They live in London. They live in Richmond. And that was their complaint. There were too many Poles. Large numbers of East Europeans have left for more successful economies. Britain was a very popular choice. Now, unfortunately, a lot of them have had to leave Britain because either the jobs aren't there, or they're really not welcome anymore. And they've returned. And as you know, if you read the papers recently, Britain has a labor shortage because they very much depended on East European immigrants to fill their labor. And a lot of them have left. The other thing I'd say, V, which is really interesting to me, is that while I was researching this presentation, I looked at birth rates for Eastern Europe. They're really low. So they range from about 1.2 to 1.4. That is nowhere near replacement rate. So now you've got an out migration looking for better opportunities. And again, some people don't go that far. Some people go to Czechia because Czechia has a relatively advanced economy. But you've got out migration occurring, and you've also got a very low, way below replacement rate birth rate. And as a result, these countries are almost all losing population. So just think 30 years ago, when I went to Bulgaria, it had 10 million people. It has now something over 7. They didn't all die. They literally moved away, or some of them did die. And the 1.2 birth rate is not enough to replace the people who pass on. So these countries are all losing population. I don't think there's a single one of them that is actually growing at this point. And by the way, making sure they don't get immigrants from places like Syria, Africa, even though, you know, they would probably improve the economy quite a bit.
Thank you. Kimberly Scott asks the second question. Given your vast experience in the region, what does your crystal ball indicate for Russia's playbook in Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and other conflicted former USSR states?
You know, it's really difficult to, this is a great cop-out on my part. It is so difficult to predict. You almost think that there is no end in sight because Russia enjoys the tension. I think Putin honestly believes that the more pressure points he finds for Europe, and I'll concentrate just on Europe right now, and the more pressure he can apply, the more he can get the Europeans, and I think it's more not to do things he doesn't want them to do, rather than do things. And I think this pressure serves a purpose. It serves notice that I'm not going to let you operate completely independently. I have a much bigger military than any of you do. And I'm going to make sure that it's obvious. It's obvious in Georgia. It's obvious in Ukraine. It's interesting too, the Russian role that was played, which I thought was fascinating, Armenia and Azerbaijan recently. And Russia ended up basically sort of semi-rescuing Armenia, but really kind of left the pressure on there. And I think that was a fascinating example of it. It's almost as if just keeping things hot enough serves Russians' interests. So I don't think they're really seeking resolution right now. I don't know when it would come, and I'm not sure what would be the payoff to Russia to end the pressure that Putin is putting on. Was that a good cop out?
Very, very good, actually. We have a person, Jay Kleinman, who would like
Yeah.
to
Bill,
unmute himself.
Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry
yes.
for the misspelling and everything else. So I have a multi-part question, and it has to do with inviting the countries into the EU and NATO.
Mm-hmm.
I remember even someone like Pat Buchanan, who I never agree with, said when we did that, he thought that putting missiles in Poland was crazy because it would immediately threaten the Soviet Union and Russia.
Right.
And he thought that was a mistake. And he, certainly you couldn't get more anti-Soviet than Pat Buchanan. And I wonder, and related to that is the whole issue of reunification, which Helmut Kohl deserves certainly a lot of credit.
Right.
I agree, but certainly East Germany did not have a long history of democracy, or even of 40 years or 50 years of really denazification. The Stasi were more apt than the Gestapo, as far as I understand. And
Right.
and
So do you
so
have a question?
yeah, so I want Bill's thinking about that. That I mean the right wing in Germany is largely located in East Germany.
Right.
Just some of your thoughts about that.
Thank you, Jay.
And I think it's very interesting because the right wing, the alternative for Germany, that right wing party, that showed up really in the 2000s, had its greatest strength, as you mentioned, in East Germany. And East Germany did not have any real democratic tradition, actually, at all. And all of a sudden, that country, that little piece of Germany, was faced with a tremendous economic chaos that capitalism brought in. All those industries that had been built up under the communist days, and typically communist states relied on heavy industry. So I remember when I was in Bulgaria, I would visit the steel factories in Bulgaria, and they produced steel nobody wanted, right? But they were still there. They were still producing steel because the communists said, we want big steel plants. And there are other things that communists do that are fairly common like that. And all of a sudden, that whole industry in East Germany went away. And the East Germans had to think about a whole new way of living. And I think there was some anger at that because suddenly even though communism is not a great system, certainly, it also offers some security, some real security, that it's low level. I mean, it's as long as you don't mess with the state, you're secure. But it does offer some economic security that capitalism, unless you've got a really good advanced social welfare state, doesn't seem to offer. And I think there was a lot of anger in East Germany about that, and they felt cheated, and they felt like there's nothing that capitalism offers us except to go to the West, which they weren't very much in favor of. And I think you're right. I think no democratic tradition really, and a complete disruption of the economic process. And then you asked me one more, Jay. I can't remember what
about Poland and putting missiles, incorporating them into NATO,
Right.
which was bound, it seems to me, to be threatening to an emerging Russia.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think the most reasonable thing would have been not to change the mix of weapon systems that were already there, and not to put anything in there like a missile system. These were anti-missile systems, right? They were designed to shoot down other missiles. I don't think it was necessary to put them in. I don't think they gained us anything in terms of our security, but I think they did look like to the Soviets, I mean the Russians,
Right.
they could be. Now, this was a really ridiculous to me interpretation, but you could always use the argument that they were making our offensive weapons, which were responsible for deterrence, right? They were making those offensive weapons unusable, and therefore they were promoting the possibility that the United, and I think this is absurd, but okay, this is the argument, they were promoting the possibility that the United States would launch a first strike and
Mhm.
use the first strike to disable Soviet command and control, Russian command and control. And then the other missiles that survived and would take off would be shot down by these anti-missile systems. It's a really crazy scenario, but it's enough. The Russians are very sensitive about this. Anything that threatens their ability to exercise deterrence, they regard it as a threat. So I just, from that standpoint, I just wouldn't have done it because I don't think the gain to NATO or the United States was significant.
Right.
I think it was more of it hurt us more to antagonize Russia in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for your question. Okay, I think we have time for one more question for Bill before we let him go. If anybody else would, there's nothing in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask? Oh, okay, I do have one from Leslie Bryant. How did it happen that the US had secret prisons in places like Romania, and what has become of them?
I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know what's become of them. They may still be out there. I really haven't really looked into that. But the reason we had them was we wanted to take terrorists out of the Middle East and send them to other places so we wouldn't have to put them in Guantanamo. And we certainly weren't going to bring them back to American soil. So we exported them. We exported them to Dubai. We exported them to Romania. A bunch of different countries agreed to take these so-called terrorists and hold them in prison. And that was because the United States did not want the responsibility of doing that. So that's why they were created. I honestly don't know where they are today. That's a really good question.
Well, Bill, thank you for being such a good friend to the Camden Conference. And thank you for your wonderful presentation tonight. I believe I've learned more about that portion of our world than I had ever imagined possible for myself in one short, well-presented time period. So thank you very much. And everybody just clap your hands for Bill and give him a hearty hi-oh or send him some private messages over the chats. Yes, yes. Thank you.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you,
Bravo.
Bill. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed being here tonight. And it's wonderful that what the Camden Conference does. I just think it's absolutely terrific. And remember, if you want to know more about what the world, and there's V, hi V, and Fred, hi Fred. If you want to know more about the World Affairs Council of Maine, you can go to a website called WAC. We call it WAC.MAINE. So WACMaine.org. Actually, no, a WAC Maine, no dot between WAC and Maine.org, and learn more about the programs that we have. We have a very interesting program coming up on the 10th of November, which of course now I'm forgetting what the program is all about anyway, but I'm sure it'll be a good one if I can remember what it was. But WACMaine.org, and you can find out about our programs.
Thank you, Bill. Just to give you a hearty hi-ho about next month's presentation, December 2nd at 6:30 p.m. via Zoom, the Rockland Library will again be hosting a Camden Conference community event. And it's Europe, the New World Order and the Challenges of the 21st Century by another friend of the Camden Conference, Matthew Ward. So be sure to ask M for the Zoom link. And thank you again, Em, for allowing us to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Bill, for such a fascinating talk. It was
Yeah.
really lovely to have you.
I got to make one more comment because it's cybersecurity on the 10th of November. I just remembered. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.